crowds of adults as well. And when stuff with young people goes well, it goes spectacularly well, and when it goes awful, you just end up completely bewildered about the nature of the world and young people in general. I was doing an event in Listowel at the Listowel Writers' Festival, which is a big event in Ireland, and they decided they would have all the events for young adults in a circus tent, because there's a circus in town. That was a splendid idea. And so they rolled 400 kids of various ages, from about 8 to 16, into the circus tent, 400 of them. And I could feel the blood draining from the face. You can't talk to 8-year-olds and 16-year-olds, and I thought this was a disaster. But I was the first person up, and I decided to try and engage some of them in conversation. So I went to the 8-year-olds in front, and I said, "So I just got a national, so my mother's from this part of the country, you come forward, blah, 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 blah." The hand goes up at the back. And I said, "Yeah." And this kid said, "Do you have any lions?" And I said, "I don't think you've been briefed properly. Although we are in a circus tent, this is not in fact a circus." I'm nothing like debating semantics with an 8-year-old at 10 o'clock in the morning. And I said, "We're going to do literature and books of science. We're really very science." Fantastic. Lengthy pause. "Do you have any elephants?" And I thought, "Oh Lord." It has changed the nature of the emails I get, which used to consist of emails that went, "Have you ever thought of killing someone this way? Because I have." My people. These are the kind of emails I get now. This is great. Subject line is somewhat urgent. Somewhat urgent. "Hi John. I'm hoping you can answer this before Monday, if that's not a problem. You see, I read a book called The Gates, and I have to ask you what the message or theme is in that novel for my summer school summative assignment. If you could tell me what message you were trying to send to the reader in that book, that would do a lot. Also, if you didn't mean to have a message, could you please make one up so I can get full marks?" You really want that kid to succeed, don't you? So the stuff with the unfurls has been great fun, but I thought this evening I was going to do something slightly different. Next year, I've spent now 12 years touring books and talking to readers. And it often surprises me, not in a bad way, but I realised that the mystery field is huge. And if you are coming to it for the first time, or even if you're not, even if you kind of consider yourself reasonably well read, sometimes it's hard to know where to start. What's the canon? What's the canon in mystery fiction? And it wasn't surprising, not so much readers, but I've met young writers who've no conception of anything written before about 1990. Wow. You know, they have no idea of their place in the genre, they have no idea what went before them. And I was increasingly frustrated with this. So next year, in addition to writing the Charlie Parker book, I'm editing a book in which basically we've asked pretty much every leading crime writer in the world, not just writers in America, but writers in Europe and Britain, to name the book that they felt that people should read if they were going to establish this canon. And each of them is going to write a little essay on it and explain why. And so what surprised me was how they all got it instantly. Because we've all been asked the same question: "What are you reading? What do you suggest I read?" And so they were delighted to do it. And part of the inspiration for this was that about a year or two ago, a friend and I, Declan Hughes, a very good writer, were asked to put together a list of the 10 books that we thought everybody should read if they wanted to read mystery fiction. The 10 great books, or the 10 great writers. And naturally enough, him being a fool and me being very smart, he picked stuff that I just didn't agree with. And now that he's not here, I've got to take away his ridiculous choices and just leave my own brilliance. To be fair, we only disagreed on about 2 books, I think, and part of the fun was disagreeing. But I'm going to very briefly test this out on you and see how this goes. So from one side, I've kind of copied little bits of notes and then scribbled on paper. So we'll see how this goes. It's quite interesting. I mean, the difficulty is, I suppose, what is mystery fiction? Where does it start? And what is the point at which we decide mystery fiction begins here? You could go back to Oedipus. Oedipus is a kind of mystery story, right? It's about a man trying to discover who murdered his father and finds out that he murdered his father. Hamlet's, guess, kind of mystery in it. Macbeth, to some degree, is a murder tale. Godwin's Caleb Williams, often regarded as one of the first mystery stories. Not the easiest of reads, it must be said. What about the first time we have a serious detective? Anybody want to tell me who the first serious detective is in English literature? Who's the first person who appears more than once? Sherlock Holmes? Name's Sherlock Holmes? It's not a bad guess. It's actually generally regarded as Poe's Dupin. Poe wrote 3 mystery stories featuring a detective named Dupin. And they're regarded as generally the first stories in English to feature a detective in more than one tale. So he creates the serious detective. Poe creates essentially the serious detective. And that's quite interesting. He called them tales of ratiocination. Because mystery fiction is kind of grounded in scientific rationalism. The belief that the world is intelligible through a process of logic. It kind of functions according to rules. If you understand the rules, you can understand the world. I'm not sure Poe necessarily believed that, given that Poe was quite mad. Very famous. There's an incident quite close to us when he was kind of about to go off the rails and die, and he turned up at the house of a woman that he was infatuated with, acted out apparently in a very distracted manner, and then proceeded to slice a large number of radishes before disappearing into the night. So perhaps you're kind of thinking there was somebody who's not actually entirely attuned to rationalism to begin with. But he's quite an interesting point to begin with. I thought we'd begin actually with Dashiell Hammett. Let's begin with an American writer. Hammett's kind of the beginning of a particular period in mystery fiction. Because what's the beginning of mystery fiction? Where does American mystery fiction come from? It kind of comes from the Western. There's not a great deal of difference between a character like Shane in Westerns and the early Private Eyes. And actually, Hammett is the moment when the Western novel becomes the mystery novel. He had written Westerns for Black Mass magazine. We often think of Black Mass magazine, which kind of provided a beginning for a lot of these early mystery writers. We often think of Black Mass magazine as solely being about mystery fiction, but also into Westerns. But the moment really when the Western becomes the mystery novel is Dashiell Hammett's Red Harvest, published in 1929. And in Red Harvest, an unnamed operative arrives in a small town. It's called Personville, but everybody calls it Poisonville. And there were two rival gangs. And he sets them off against each other so they wipe each other out. Incredibly violent novel. For people who complain about violence in modern mystery fiction, I mean, this is like a biblical plague. And at one point the Gok was asked, does it have to be this way? Does it have to be so violent? So many people have to die. And he replies, it's easier in this way. Easier and somehow more satisfying. It's a great statement of hard-boiled intent. But what's interesting is that there's a difference between what we call Golden Age fiction in Britain and Golden Age fiction in America. The Golden Age is that kind of 20s and 30s. It's Agatha Christie, it's Dorothy L. Sayers. But over here it's Hammett and Chandler. And I often think if you look at English mystery fiction, there's often a faith in the established order. It's quite often police members of the establishment. If you read Dorothy L. Sayers, it's Lord Peter Wimsey. Somebody from the House of Lords will come and investigate if something happens to you. I grew up in Ireland. We knew the House of Lords did not give a rat's ass about us, okay? But there was a faith in the established order. It's a matter of social order. Can't have people lying around the place. Let's trust in the police. Let's trust in the institutions. There's no faith in that in American mystery fiction. And it's no coincidence that American mystery fiction kind of finds its genesis in California. That was a state that was bought and paid for by the wealthy. And if you were poor, if you were in any way vulnerable, they would not stand up for you the way that the forces of law and order would for the wealthy and the privileged. And if that's the case, who do you go to if you're in trouble? You turn to somebody from outside, right? You turn to Shane. You turn to the private eye. And that continues to this day. If you read Michael Connolly, Harry Bosch is no more policeman than I am. He's part of the police department, but he functions entirely as a maverick. So there's that distrust in America in the established order. So Hammett's the first one. Hammett's a very interesting character. You have to remember he was a Pinkerton. He was a strikebreaker. He broke heads. He was a union basher, a literal union basher. And by the end of his life, his health has been broken because he has been jailed for refusing to name names to the communist witch trials. He goes quite a kind of interesting journey. His best novel is probably The Glass Key. I've kind of a fondness for The Dane Curse, but Glass Key is probably the one for Hammett. Although Red Harvest is very interesting because it is that moment, like I said, when the Western becomes a crime novel. And it was the basis for Kurosawa's Yojimbo, which was a samurai movie for a fistful of dollars. The Sergio Leone Clint Eastwood movie, because that was based in turn on Yojimbo. There's bits of it in the Coen Brothers Miller's Crossing, as well as bits of the Glass Key. And there's a lot of it in Walter Hill's Last Man Standing. Last Man Standing is essentially Red Harvest. So it's become quite a variety of films, a bit of a touchstone. So he's the first. After him comes Chandler. Chandler's a difficult one for me, because he is the writer that people mention, the people who don't read a lot of crime fiction go, oh, Chandler's crime mystery fiction becomes literature. That's the moment. The great literary writer. I'm not sure that's true, actually. My view of Chandler is that he was a fantastic writer. The critic Clive James once said that he was so much a better writer than he needed to be. And if you read his books, on every page there's an image that jumps out at you. Very famous at the beginning of Farewell My Lovely, Moose Malloy is described as looking like a tarantula on a slice of angel food, which is a curious image, because if you think about it, it doesn't mean anything. And there's a lot of that with Chandler. There are images that are quite striking until you look at them, and then you think, well, what does that mean exactly? There's something unpleasant about that image of a tarantula on a slice of angel food cake. It's incongruous. It bears no relation to the reality of Moose Malloy in the book. But it's a very arresting image, and he was very, very good at that. MacDonald, Ross MacDonald, who we're going to come onto in a moment, wrote of him that Chandler wrote like a slime angel, and he gave the sun-blinded streets of Los Angeles a romantic presence. He's very much into knight errantry. That's what Marlowe is. He's a kind of knight errant. Best novels of The Long Goodbye and Farewell My Love. The Big Sleep's not a great book. Very good film. Not a great book. It was two novellas that were kind of yanked together to form a book. And very famously, when they were filming it, they called, more or less in the day they began filming, they called Chandler and said, look, having a great time, thanks for the book, fantastic, great fun. Just wondering who killed the chauffeur. And Chandler said, I have no idea. And they said, you wrote the book. And he goes, I did write the book, absolutely. And therefore you killed the chauffeur in the book. And he goes, yeah, I did, absolutely. I put him, killed him on the page. So you should know who did it. You know, I know I should know, but I really don't. Because he used to say that he could never have two people in a room and keep one of them alive for any length of time. And he also used to say when he ran into trouble with the book, he'd just have somebody walk in with a gun. So he clearly just killed the chauffeur because he was a bit bored with a big sleep, and then I'll come back to it later, and then never got around to it. When they called him, he said, I can't help you, by the way, I've cashed the check. So they had to live with it. But again, that's a kind of devil's advocate view of Chandler. He certainly alters the genre. He changes it entirely, and it's never the same afterwards. And those two novels, Long Goodbye and Farewell My Love, are canonical books. After that, he should have stopped writing. The books get progressively worse. But those books are very, very good indeed. The third novelist I'm going to pick is Ross MacDonald. Now, Ross MacDonald, I bring him up right after Chandler because he's quite interesting. Chandler hated MacDonald. Hated him with a passion. If you read Chandler's letters, he did everything possible to scupper Ross MacDonald's career. They're both kind of Californian writers, but MacDonald was much, much younger. Chandler famously described him as a literary eunuch. Just despised him. And in turn, to be fair, MacDonald did his best to put the boot in on him as well. He said at one point that Chandler lacked tragic unity and regarded a good plot as one that made for good scenes as if the parts were greater than the whole, which has a kind of element of truth to it, unfortunately. But MacDonald's very, very interesting. MacDonald's the first great novelist the genre produces. First great psychological novelist, perhaps. Certainly the most compassionate, the most concerned with empathy. And he's going to make an interesting life. He should have been in jail. He was a real tearaway. He was born in California, moved to Vancouver quite early in life. Lost his virginity at the age of 8. Nearly ended up in jail. Came from a very disrupted, disturbed family. Kind of got himself together, went to university, never quite completed his doctorate. He was a passionate scholar of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Marries a woman named Margaret Miller, who probably should be on the list of kind of 15 great American crime writers. Miller herself writes very well about middle-class women, which is something that actually doesn't get touched upon a great deal in mystery fiction. Very good on their struggle, very good on immigrants as well, on the poor. Stranger in My Grave, probably the book to read by her. They have a daughter. At the age of kind of 15 or 16, she kills a young Mexican in a drink driving accident. She hits him so hard she knocks him through the windscreen of a parked car and then drives away. She gets arrested. MacDonald does not behave very well. He tells her to take the fifth, essentially, say nothing. Don't let them get you. And she's released in part, well, she gets a suspended sentence in part because of MacDonald's position in the Santa Barbara community. But it haunts both of them. It haunts MacDonald because I think he forgot that there was another child involved, and that child was dead. And it haunts his daughter, obviously. If you've killed a young man, it's going to stay with you. She goes off the rails, she disappears. MacDonald goes onto radio, talks to the media, does all the things you would if your child disappeared. You would say, look, you know, if you've run away, just call us. Let us know you're all right. We can work it out. And if somebody has her, please let her go because we love her. She turned up in a hotel room in Reno with an older man, and there was suspicion, statutory rape perhaps, but nothing ever really came of it. She got her life back together, married, had a son, died in her sleep at the age of 28. That son, in turn, MacDonald's grandson, dies of a drugs overdose in a hotel room in Nevada. He outlives both his child and his grandchild. And in the books there is this passion for children, this feeling that they suffer for the sins of their parents, that one generation suffers for the sins of the next. And Archer, his hero, first-grade empath, he says, you know, I hear voices crying in the night, I go see what's the matter. He says, I have a passion for mercy. He says the problem is to love people and serve people and to serve them without wanting anything from them. It's a marvellous statement of intent. And when you think about it, very different from English crime novels. If anybody's ever read Agatha Christie or Dorothy L. Sayers, the people who die in those books are usually not very nice people. Right. They get it in the neck because they're adulterers or petty thieves or blackmailers. But they've asked for it. Somebody once said in these books it's not murder, it is contributory negligence. And then somebody comes along and solves the crime again because it's a matter of social order. But in MacDonald's books, you feel sorry for the people who die. You feel passionately for them. You feel they did not deserve this. There's a lot of disagreement about which is MacDonald's best novel. I think it's one called The Chill from 1964. It has one of the great twists in mystery fiction. It's based on Coleridge's rhyme of The Ancient Mariner, so he has a real passion for it. It's a nearly perfect crime novel. Nearly perfect. So fascinating for a character. MacDonald, he dies in the early 80s, I think, but stops writing in the 70s. Begins to succumb to dementia, what we call dementia then, we've now called Alzheimer's. There's a very touching anecdote in Tom Nolan's biography of him, where Margaret Miller hears his typewriter going, and he hasn't typed in years because he's been ill. And you know, if a clock in your house stops and then starts again, and you hear the ticking, and it takes you a while to remember that it had been stopped to begin with. And it was a bit like that. She tiptoed into his office to see what he was doing, and he was sitting at his desk he'd written all his books at. And she went up behind him and he had typed the word broken over and over and over again on a piece of paper. It's the last thing he ever types. But the first great novelist that the genre produces, and certainly I would not be writing without him. So he's the third. So we have Hammett, Chandler, and MacDonald. The fourth, a man named George B. Higgins, and a book called The Friends of Eddie Cole, 1972. Higgins was an interesting man. He started out representing mobsters. He was a mob lawyer and eventually ends up as a kind of prosecutor. So he serves both sides. Very dialogue-driven books. Very dialogue-driven. The opening sentence of that one is, if I can find it on my piece of paper, in fact I may even have the book. I was going to wave these books at you. You have copies of some of these books here. George B. Higgins and Friends of Eddie Cole. One of the great American grand novels. He never wrote anything as good again, to be fair. Jackie Brown, at 26, with no expression on his face, said that he could get some guns. It's a simple statement. Get your pieces probably by tomorrow night. I can get you probably 6 pieces tomorrow night. In a week or so, maybe 10 days, another dozen. We got a guy coming in with at least 10 of them. We already talked to another guy about 4 of them, and he's, expecting them. He's got something to do. So 6 tomorrow night, another dozen in a week. They are massively dialogue-driven. Because Higgins believed that people reveal themselves through what they say. You don't necessarily need somebody in the background, the novelist saying, here's why he's doing what he did, here's why he looked. Dialogue. He wanted to be reckoned as the Dickens of Boston, to be fair, so he certainly had no illusions about how good he was, to be absolutely fair on him. And he got quite resentful when people felt that they were belittling him. This is what Higgins says: I'm not doing dialogue because I like doing dialogue. The characters are telling you the story. I'm not telling you the story, they're going to do it. If I do it right, you will get the whole story. What's really interesting if you read The Friends of Eddie Cole is that everything everybody says is an attempt to gain leverage. Words are a weapon. Sentences are weapons. Everything is, because nobody trusts anybody else. Friends of Eddie Cole is about an old mobster. It's about to go back to jail. And he's wondering if he should betray his friends. Can he betray his friends and stay out of jail? And so everybody, you can't trust anything anybody says. And when it was eventually made into a movie, it was the last great role given to Robert Mitchum. It's Mitchum's swan song, The Friends of Eddie Cole, and he is brilliant in it. But the reality is, as you realise, as the book goes on and the film goes on, is that the truth about Eddie Cole is that Eddie Cole has no friends. But a brilliant, brilliant novel. A very big influence on a lot of literary writers. If you read Roddy Doyle is very influenced by George B. Higgins. The books are laid out, very dialogue-driven. And in the beginning, Doyle was criticised for essentially writing plays, but he wasn't. He believed what Higgins did. You strip everything back. It is what people say. They reveal themselves in what they say. So, the Friends of Eddie Cole. If MacDonald is one writer that I wouldn't be, if one novelist I wouldn't be writing about, this is the other, James Lee Burke. James Lee Burke is the greatest living crime novelist. We can differ on this, but you'll be wrong. Jack Nicholson once said of Marlon Brando, when he dies, everybody else moves up one. It's a lovely piece of praise. Burke is the great poet of landscape in American writing, I think, in modern American writing. And also, unlike a lot of these writers, he doesn't come from a mystery background. His background is Southern Gothic literature. His background is Faulkner. And landscape's very interesting in mystery fiction. It doesn't really matter where you set a piece of women's contemporary fiction. That's not really, the landscape is not particularly important in that case. It's very important in mystery fiction. And I think that's because there are two journeys taking place in the mystery novel. One is an exploration of a psychic landscape, an internal landscape, a psychological landscape. It's why people do the things that they do. What makes them what they are. But it takes place against a physical backdrop. The detective moves around. And if you get the landscape right, you achieve a resonance between those two things. I think it's why Scandinavian crime fiction is so popular at the moment. We make certain associations with the Scandinavian landscape. It's cold, it's hostile, it has these quite liberal, very modern cities embedded in them. But if we're all going on holidays to places like Florida and Cancun, why are we buying Scandinavian crime fiction? Shouldn't we be buying Mexican and Florida crime fiction? But maybe that doesn't have quite the same resonance for us. In the same way, Burke's best novels, I think, are the Robichaud books set in Louisiana. Because I think his theme is the corruption of the human soul. And where better to set it than in a state that is mired in corruption? And I don't mean simply in the organizational sense that, the institutions of New Orleans are notoriously corrupt, but the state itself is corrupted. Everything, if you look at its decay, that kind of heat, the sense of things just rotting and falling apart, feeding what comes up, other things growing out of it. I mean, that's where they're meant to be set. And maybe the other books that he writes, although they're fantastic pieces of fiction, don't have the same resonance. He sets a series of books in Montana. I'm not sure we make the same associations with Montana. They're beautiful books in their own right. And this is the first great post-Katrina crime novel. Maybe the first great post-Katrina novel. Really excellent piece of work. And most people they fall back and Burke to the time when, the first one I read was Black Cherry Blues. They're all wonderful. Burke is just a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant novelist. Let's step back a bit. Hammett, Chandler, MacDonald. I'd go MacDonald, Chandler, and then maybe the third great American crime novelist is a woman, is Patricia Highsmith. Highsmith's not read quite as much anymore. Not sure why that is. Otto Penzler, who you were quite well, who was a mysterious bookseller, once described her as a relentlessly ugly person. And that may be part of it. Highsmith was not a nice human being. Even before she was born, I think her mother wanted her aborted. This is a woman who had not experienced a great deal of love, and I don't think felt a great deal of love for the world. But it makes her fiction fantastic. She wrote the Ripley books. So most of us maybe seen John Malkovich as Ripley in Ripley's Game, or we saw Matt Damon as Ripley in the Mr. Ripley movie. The Ripley books are very good. Possibly not her best book. Her best book, I think, is a book called Deep Water, written in 1957. There is a copy of it. Oh, I hope there is, because I think I brought them all up. Oh, it was here. There we go. Deep Water. Yay! Deep Water by Patricia Highsmith. Deep Water is a very, very interesting book. It's about a man named Victor Van Allen who lives in a lovely kind of posh little New England, kind of upstate New Yorkish, Connecticutish town. He runs a kind of little poetry press. And he is being cuckolded by his wife repeatedly. And she waves the men that she's going out with in front of him. And he has retreated into his garage where he raises snails. There is something appalling about Victor Van Allen. And I'm not giving much of this away, so it happens about the first chapter, but when she brings her latest conquest into a party, he sidles up to him and says, I killed, you want to be careful, I killed one of the men my wife was having an affair with. I'd kill you. So just you behave yourself. And when the guy looks it up, actually the man who was having an affair with Victor Van Allen's wife has been killed. And he begins to wonder. And that's the starting point. But what she does brilliantly is she makes us re-empathise with Victor Van Allen. This man with snails in his garage. You know, how does she do that? He's this kind of weird sexless being. And yet she makes us root for him, maybe because he does something. In this kind of lovely, prim, cosseted, self-satisfied little town, Victor Van Allen does something. The worm turns, or the snail turns, if you prefer. But a really, really brilliant piece of fiction. I don't think Highsmith ever really wrote a bad book, although she was, as I say, quite an appalling person. Strangers on the Train was her first big success, made obviously into a film by Alfred Hitchcock. So right from the beginning, she was playing with those notions of identity. Of who do we want the murderer to get away with it? If we committed a murder, we'd probably quite like to get away with it. She's very good on that. So that's the sixth person I would pick. The seventh is mildly controversial, actually, and I'm going to pick because it's not just one book, it's 3 books. It's Thomas Harris. I wrote my first novel. My first novel was published in 1999. It took me 5 years to write. And I remember thinking, because it was a serial killer book, and I've never written a serial killer book since, but I remember thinking that the worst thing that could happen to me would be that after a 10-year silence, Thomas Harris would produce the sequel to The Silence of the Lambs. But I thought that's not going to happen. He hasn't written a book in ages. Lo and behold, in the year that my book came out, Thomas Harris published the sequel to The Silence of the Lambs. And unfortunately, my English publishers put a sticker on the book saying, as good as Thomas Harris or your money back, and I felt I should just be carrying around wads of tenors. Because, you know, maybe we should all have stopped writing serial killer novels a long time ago. Maybe we should have stopped after Silence of the Lambs. Maybe, in fact, we should have stopped after Red Dragon, 1981. Still the finest serial killer novel ever written. Why I picked the 3 of them is because they're interconnected. We're not going to mention the 4th book, Hannibal Rising. It's an appalling book. It was actually written as a screenplay. And when the film began to be made, Harris turned it into a novel. So it's a novelization. It's not even a novel. Dreadful piece of work. The first 3 are fantastic. Because he touches on something very, very interesting. It's why I put him after Highsmith. If you read Red Dragon is about a man named Will Graham. And Will Graham what he does is he sent to crime scenes and he can visualize how they occurred. He can kind of put himself in the position of the killer. And I guess what Harris is wondering is, if you can do that, how different are you from the killer? If you can think it, if you can visualize it, I mean, isn't that the huge first step towards doing it? And I guess what we're arguing is the flip side of the detective is the killer and vice versa. You know, they are parts of the same kind. And there is an interdependency between the two. What would the police do if there was no crime? Would there be any point to them? You know, that actually they need these people to justify their existence, to give it some meaning. And then we move on to Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs is obviously the first novel that puts Lecter centre stage. And what do we have in Silence of the Lambs? We have Clarice Starling, this innocent young woman, innocent young FBI agent, who's sent in to kind of lure him into saying things. And he sees something in her. He's attracted to something in her. And that's how she gets information out of him. When we come to Hannibal, and Hannibal, you have to remember, is a book that's generally loathed, I think. The critic Martin Amis once said it was a mausoleum of dead prose. But most people's difficulty with it lay with the ending, and I'm going to try and talk very carefully around the ending without giving it away. So many people have read Hannibal. Not many, okay, some people, but it's interesting to read it in the context of those books. Because I think what most people were would be expecting is a confrontation at some point between Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter. A kind of resolution of that. And that maybe there'll be violence. But if you look at this book, it begins with Clarice Starling having no life. She's been suspended from the FBI. She has no relationship. She has no children. She appears to have no boyfriend. The sole reason for her existence is Hannibal Lecter. Isn't that a kind of... If our whole existence is justified by one person, if we can't imagine our lives without them, if we need them that badly to give meaning to our lives, isn't that a form of love? Isn't that what love is? In a kind of way, you can look at the Clarice Starling relationship with Hannibal Lecter as a kind of lover's pursuit. And the question Harris asks is, can you kill the thing that you love? So worth reading those 3 novels in that context, bearing that in mind. Because that idea of the detective as the flip side of the criminal runs through a lot of crime fiction. We're going to come to it later as well. But that's why I picked Harris. Really, we should all have just stopped writing serial killer books. You know, nobody's ever done it better than him. So what's the point? The 8th is Ed McBain. Ed McBain. One of the lovely things about mystery fiction is that why we have so much affection for it, I think, is because it allows us to revisit characters year after year after year. Most fiction doesn't allow us to do that. Literary fiction very rarely does it. Updike did it occasionally. Larry McMurtry did it quite a lot. But generally speaking, it's not really the preserve of literature. Historical fiction does it. If you read Bernard Cornwell, you can read the Sharp novels, say, over and over again. Fantasy does it, but you have to read like 900-page novels to do it. You know, you have to commit huge periods of your life. I'm currently three novels into George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, or Game of Boobs, if anybody's seen the TV series. And so they'd be quite interested. So I said, you should get out of your comfort zone and read some fantasy. And I thought, I can't read George R.R. Martin. So I had to start the fourth book, and everybody says, oh, the fourth book isn't very good. Says, that's it, you know, the fifth one's fine, but the fourth one's not very good. See, the fourth one's 800 pages long. But I have to read a bad book to get to a good book. What kind of sense does that make? At least mystery fiction keeps it short, you know. But if you had begun reading McBain when you began writing in the 50s, I mean, McBain was still writing into this century. You would have been following the same characters for more than half a century. How can you not develop affection for them? Being able to delve into these people's lives. It's why when I've been doing my tours, it's often women who come up to me and go, oh, nothing's going to happen to Charlie Parker. You know, you're not planning on killing him, are you? Or Angel and Louis, I like them a lot. If you kill them, I'd be very upset. When a woman reader says that to a writer, your misery warning light flashes on. You know, you see yourself being hobbled in a basement somewhere. And what I've come to realise, actually, is that my readers would prefer it if I died. They don't want my characters to die. They would, if it comes down to it, where the characters lived and I died. You know, and I think that's quite flattering in a really mad way, but, you know, still. But McBain is the beginning of the police procedural. When I wrote my first book, I named a character Fat Ollie Watts, because he had a character called Fat Ollie Weeks. And I named a lot of characters in my early books around writers that I'd admired, because I wanted people to see that I was doffing the cap to them and saying that these were important to me. And I got a phone call from a bookseller saying, Ed McBain saying, you know, Ed McBain's going to sue you. And I went, really? Why? And she said, because you stole one of his character's names. And I said, I didn't steal it. It was an homage. I was doffing the cap. He says, he doesn't care about you doffing your cap. You'll see it in court. And it took a bit of back and forth before he actually consented not to sue me. And some years later, we had a store, short stories in the same volume. When I met him, he was dying, and he had one of those weird, because he had cancer, he had one of those weird things that you had to speak through. And I said to him, look, we haven't met, but I believe we probably had a misunderstanding at the start of my career. And he sent me a very gracious email saying, look, I'm sorry, I was a bit annoyed at the time over Hill Street Blues. And Hill Street Blues by this point had been, you know, it was in repeats. You know, it hadn't been made for years. But he always felt Hill Street Blues had stolen the 87 precinct. Had stolen that whole conception of this group of people operating in this environment. Because going back to what we were saying about landscape, one of the things about crime fiction is that it needs a contained environment. It can't roam. Thrillers can roam. They can go from place to place, country to country. If you think about it, all mystery novels tend to be set in quite enclosed spaces. Whether it's a town, or even a city that seems like a town, or a particular county or a state, we associate detectives with locales. When you think about it, Harry Bosch's Los Angeles, Scarpetto, Richmond, Virginia, we make those associations. And McBain really took that to, you know, he recreates Manhattan Island, essentially, he recreates New York City, but so much of it is in this little room where all of these detectives work together. He was also the first crime novelist I ever read. Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man. It's the first crime novel I ever read, so I probably wouldn't be writing crime fiction without him. And because he wrote so much, he's a bit underrated. And to be fair, from about the 50s to the early 80s, you know, after that the novels peter off a bit, but we're talking 30 years of novels. You're probably entitled to peter off a bit after 30 years of good fiction. So, Let's Hear It for the Deaf Man, Ed McBain, any of the 87 precinct novels. If you haven't read them, they are the great series of police procedurals. We're nearly there, for those of you who may be feeling flagging slightly. I was torn a little bit between two books, and so I'm going to cheat slightly and put them both together. The first is The Last Good Kiss, 1978, by James Crumley. It's the first great post-Vietnam crime novel. The other is probably Cutter's Way. I would think, is probably the other great kind of novel of dissolution of America, the society falling apart. It's got generally regarded by writers as one of the great first lines in mystery fiction. When I finally caught up with Abraham Traherne, he was drinking beer with an alcoholic bulldog named Fireball Roberts in a ramshackle joint just outside of Sonoma, California, drinking the heart right out of a spring afternoon. And it's interesting to mention because it is a kind of reworking of The Long Goodbye. You can read it as a commentary on The Long Goodbye, so it's quite interesting to read it alongside Chandler, or a little bit after Chandler, because they're very, very similar. Again, not big on plot. His thing is character. Fascinated by character. And again, he was writing, he was a fascinating man. He's one of those people that's generally regarded as a writer's writer. Mystery writers loved him. He was a big, larger-than-life bear of a man. About a year before he died, we ended up sitting next to each other at a signing, and we'd met about 2 years before. And he had said to me, you're Irish, you should be drinking whiskey. And I did point out it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, so even being Irish, I don't think that would have bothered James Crumley. But he said, next time, why don't you just drink whiskey? More or less he was saying, why don't you man up, grow a bear, And so the next time I ended up sitting beside him again, and he looked at me and he said, I know you. And I said, yeah, I was the Irish writer. And he said, I bet you. Look at you. And look, here you are again, early in the morning, not a drink on you. And I pulled out a bottle of Middleton Irish Rare that I brought with me, and I kind of went, screw you, more or less. The downside of that was that he made me drink from it at 10 o'clock in the morning. I don't think I ever quite recovered, but he was a fascinating man. Last Good Kiss, probably there's maybe 2 or 3 novels that are nearly as good as it, but really The Last Good Kiss is just the greatest novel Crumley ever did, and I think for various reasons he never produced anything quite as good again. You'd put it alongside a book called Miami Blues by Charles Willeford from 1984. Willeford's very interesting. There's an old statement about the nature of the world which says that I think it was Horace Walpole said it's a tragedy to those who think, it's a tragedy to those who feel and a comedy to those who think. And Willeford's a thinker. And he says if you write a novel that's if you think hard enough in a novel, if you write a novel that's contemplative enough, people will mistake it for black comedy. It was made into a very good film with Alec Baldwin, actually, and Fred Ward, I think it was Fred Ward. But just a very, very fine character-driven crime novel. Central character, Hope Mosley, appears, I think, in 4 of his books. Just one of those very engaging characters. But he writes very well about men and kind of how kind of pathetic we are. Any woman here will read Willeford and go, God, they are really like that. They are really that desperately sad. We saw ourselves in Willeford, I think. And the last novel is this one. How many people have read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd? One person. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Well, you will all have to make up for that by reading The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It is one of the essential mystery novels. You should read it, because it is... The difficulty is you can't talk about it without giving anything away. And perhaps what's interesting about it is not what people expect of Christie who have not read her. And perhaps it's not what people will think of Christie who have read her. And when you read this book, an awful lot of what I've been talking about will come together and will coalesce. You'll see a lot of these themes arise in it. It's a very interesting experiment in narrative, and is worth reading on that basis alone. Because Christie gets a hard time of it from younger authors, especially male authors. She's often described as a cosy writer. Christie's a cosy writer. Cosy. And kind of a dismissive manner. And in part that was because I think she was a woman. Male writers are still quite dismissive of female writers. And that's true of most fiction. I think female writers are more inclined to read male writers than male readers are to read female writers. And I think people kind of dismiss Christie as kind of writing about English people, old people in English villages. Lovely, pretty, very nice. Look at what this woman writes. These are villages where apparently everybody, it's a lovely village with flowers on the lawn, it's got a little church, and everybody hates everybody else. Everybody despises them. Everybody is doing something to undermine the people around them. People are having affairs. People are conspiring over each other's shoulders. People actually there's bitter hatred. She's actually a much more insidious writer than she appears. She's a much more interesting writer than she appears. She's fascinated by poisons, as a lot of female writers are. And maybe it's because poison is a very female way of killing. Men don't tend to poison. If you talk to police people or policemen or coroners, somebody is poisoned, they'll usually look for a woman. Because by and large, women are weaker, physically weaker than men. You know, there are some, obviously I've dated some who could have taken me in a fight, but by and large, you know, the thing is you can kill a man. That means you can kill a man without getting very near him, without getting into a physical engagement with him. And it's quite easy to do. And you can do it over a period of time. It's a woman's way of killing. Christie was particularly fascinated by it, particularly like poisons. And so if you were looking for kind of a grounding in mystery fiction, those would be the kind of people you'd turn to. There are a couple of additional ones. I mentioned John Connolly earlier. Connolly's great. This is one of the great first novels in crime literature, The Black Echo. First Harry Bosch novel. It's a brilliant, brilliant piece of crime fiction. Nothing more needs to be said about it. Except the four great Californian crime novelists, and again we can agree to differ on this, or we won't agree because you'll still be wrong. James M. Cain, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, Ross MacDonald. None of them Californian really, in the real terms. I mean, you know, yeah, MacDonald was born there, but lived most of his early years in Canada. Chandler was born in Illinois, educated in Dulwich in England, spent some time in Waterford, goes back to California to work in the oil business. And Cain and Hammett were born in Maryland, which is kind of as geographically, culturally and socially distinct from California as you can get. Yet if you want an impression from Californian life from the 20s when Hammett begins writing until the 70s when MacDonald stops, those are the writers you turn to. There is a tolerance for outsiders in detective fiction, particularly in American detective fiction, because the central characters are outsiders. And perhaps because most Americans are outsiders. You're relatively recent arrivals. Connolly, born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, goes to Florida, spends most of his childhood and early youth there. Doesn't even get to California until his late 20s. And he gets a job in journalism. It's the first time he even goes to California. But now we look upon him as one of the great commentators, I suppose, in California. Tolerance for outsiders, the only reason I have a job. And a couple of other ones. Because Laura Lippman, this is one of the, What the Dead Know, one of the best crime novels of the last 10 years. Simply a wonderful piece of mystery fiction. A writer really working at the top of her game about the disappearance of two young girls. And then one of them reappears again many years later. And people try to find out what it is that happened to her. And in the nicest possible way, I think it's a book that only a woman could have written. There is just something in it that you don't get with a male writer. Something extra there. These two, for people who like historical mysteries, a lot of us do. This is the great Umberto Eco's Name of the Rose. Doesn't get really much better than that, except it does. Morality Play. And I love this book. Morality Play by Barry Ainsworth. I read this book and just fell in love with Morality Play. Morality Play is brilliant. Morality Play is about a group of travelling players at a time when all drama had to be kind of religious by nature. Had to have a kind of purpose, a religious purpose to it. And they arrive in a small town during a snowstorm when there's been a killing. And they gradually kind of get drawn into investigating it. And they decide to put on a play. And the play is a commentary on what they believe is the solution to this murder. It's kind of like, it's almost like the end of Hamlet. If you remember at the end of Hamlet, there's a play, there's a drama. This takes it to the next step. So atmospheric. And just so, it was made into a not terribly bad movie with Willem Dafoe, but that's not exactly a ringing endorsement of it. And you miss just, I'm sure it's fantastic prose, just the sense of menace in this, but also the sense of something being created. These people creating an entirely new art form, modern drama that doesn't have to be a commentary on literature, because most actors did religious plays. They did mystery plays, which were versions of Bible stories. That's what you toured around with. The idea that you wouldn't do that you do something based on real life. Brilliant. We're nearly there. It's the last one. The Chronicle of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. This is a Californian detective novel. But it ends a chapter before a normal crime novel would end. And maybe that's somehow the difference between the literary novel and the mystery novel. If we pick up a novel from the mystery bookshop, we kind of expect it to have an ending. If it doesn't, we'll be inclined to go to the person's house and demand their money back and find out where they lived. But perhaps precisely the point of this is that it doesn't really. or the ending is not quite what you expected. A novelist called Peter Ackroyd does the same thing with Hawksmoor, which is in a way, is very similar novel. Another great historical mystery. But I love the kind of book. It's a really interesting commentary on California crime fiction. Really, really smart book. Also has the benefit of being probably the only short book that Pynchon ever wrote. For anybody who's ever tried to struggle through V or Gravity's Rainbow, if anyone says, have you read Pynchon, at least you pick this one up, you can read it in a couple of days, you know. Like, yeah, I read a bit. I read a little Pynchon. Miserably, in this case, you read a little Pynchon. There's about 2 copies of each of these books for sale at the back of the store, if anybody feels the urge to do it. But they are, I think, that would be, if you had to read 10 great novelists in the genre, those would be the writers that you read, and you could have considered yourself to have really given yourself a kind of very nice grounding. But if I were to get a different author to stand up here, you might get 10 very different choices, and that I accept. But again, they would be wrong. Okay, does anybody have a question they want to ask? Having heard all of that, have you been delighted long enough? You came here thinking you were going to have a nice evening, and instead you get a lecture. You know, damn it. We do have a T-shirt giveaway. Oh, sorry, the last 3 digits only. Apparently, I've been told. There's little badges and things in the back. Did you write that?
485.
485. Well done, you. 485. Oh, look at you. There you go. There's a T-shirt waiting for you at the back.
Yeah, mine.
I'm around to chat. I'm around to sign people's books. We do have some little bags of badges on the back, button badges which you must wear. If I see any of you on the streets of Portland over the next week or 2, you're not wearing your button badges, I'll be very, very annoyed with you. Just to keep you posted, the Infernal's just out. I am about. I hope while I'm here to finish a draft of the next Parker novel, which will come out, I would imagine, September next year. I can't see it coming out before then. And I imagine more or less simultaneously with that, or a little bit after, will be this book about crime fiction by all of these writers. So at least you can't say I'm not sitting around in my vest watching, children's television. I am trying at least to get some stuff done. So nobody has a question. Oh, sir, yes, well done, go.
You ever read a story that was set in Ireland or the UK at all?
UK, yes. A lot of the ghost stories and nocturnes are set there, and the Gates and the Infernals and the Book of Lost Things are set there. I've never wanted to set a novel in Ireland, and I never will. The whole point was to get away from Ireland. The expectations of being an Irish writer, it's too close to home. When I write about it here, I don't have to be an Irish writer. I think it was in the Colin Devine's introduction to the Penguin Anthology of Irish Fiction, it was said that to be an Irish writer is to be engaged with the nature of Irishness. And I can think of nothing I wanted to be engaged with less than the nature of Irishness. So, no, I can't see myself doing it. There's a certain freedom in not having to do it, to be honest. Would anybody else like to ask anything? Folks? Oh, yes, miss.
What made you start doing science fiction fantasy? Good question.
It was kind of a development, really. The Book of Lost Things, I suppose, was close to it, in that I wanted to write about folk tales and fairy tales. And I also realised I'm interested in writing about childhood. That comes up in all of the books. Childhood is the connection between everything that I write. And I wanted to write something that was funny and frightening. And writers just get ideas, and sometimes you'll use them and sometimes you won't use them. And I had an idea about a small boy who discovers his neighbours were trying to open the gates of hell. Satanism for children. I thought, it's an untapped market. Why hasn't anybody done that before? I wondered. I just couldn't figure out how to do it. And then I got very interested in reading about the Large Hadron Collider and became interested in quantum physics. I should do. And I saw a way into the book, that the book became not just this story, but there was a commentary on the story, and I could put in just everything that fascinated me, anything I found. And I like the collision between science and fantasy, and science and concepts of religion and things. I thought they could all go in there very well. And I like it so much that I'm actually working on something at the moment, which is an entirely science fiction novel, which was written for slightly older, probably 16, 17, 18-year-olds. With a teenage girl at the centre of it. But these are all experiments. They're all written out of contract. There's no guarantee the publishers will publish them. I just like doing them. And again, to go back to what I was, it's freedom. Sometimes you look for the freedom to experiment. And I was out of my comfort zone. It's too easy to keep just writing crime fiction. You could just fall into a kind of trap of being a bit satisfied with that, and the books would get bad if they haven't already. author books would get worse. But what is great is that if you go and do other things, you come back to them refreshed and have learned something new. And those books in turn become reinvigorated. So they're all part of the same great plan, I suppose. Just on that, one other thing I wanted to talk about given we're at university is very briefly about writing. I'm sure there are people here who are trying to write or have considered writing. I would be the worst person to hold workshops in the world because I would just stand up and go, I don't know. How do you write? I really don't know. I'm afraid to think about it and I'm not sure. But I only know a couple and they're very, very short. The first is that most writers would rather do anything except write. It's a bit like going to the gym. It's better having gone to the gym than being at the gym. And writing's a bit like that. There are most days you kind of think, oh, no, I don't want to sit and do it. It's sunny out and, they're showing like 12 hours of Cheers on the Comedy Channel or whatever it may be. Any kind of distraction at all. But I come from a journalist background and I learned that you have to sit down and write. Because sometimes people think that they're going to wait for the news to strike them. You have to be in a certain mood to write. The sun has to be in a perfect position. The light has to be falling on your desk. There can't be leaves tumbling down outside because the noise might distract you. That kind of thing. And in fact, the muse very rarely strikes at all. The muse is really busy. The muse has a lot of people to sit. And generally what happens is, for one day in any novel, I will have a perfect day. I will sit down and I will write 3,000 or 4,000 words. They will come pouring out of me without any effort at all. And even in the finished novel, I'll barely have to change them. And I will think, I've got the hang of it now. After 15 books, to see how it's done. Oh, it's going to be gravy from now on. I'll have a yacht. And then the next day you go right back to trudging through it again. It's really peculiar. It happens with every book. The second thing I know is that doubt is part of the process. Every book that I've written I wanted to throw away after 20,000 words. I thought, this is the book where I get found out. This is the book where they come back and a big huge bloke knocks on my door and says, did you buy that television with our money? That it was all a dreadful error. Because everybody does anything creative, whether you're doing painting or singing or playing an instrument or writing a book, you're always looking for the one person in the crowd who isn't clapping. Because that's the voice in your own head made manifest. And sometimes I think people who try to write think, oh, I'm not meant to do this. My enthusiasm was run out. And maybe I wasn't meant to be a writer or a musician or whatever it may be. That's part of the process. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it. It's that moment of how you deal with that doubt. Do you persevere going through it? That determines whether you're going to finish it. And just to say that, I think I can't imagine any writer or artist does not have that moment in anything worthwhile. Along with that will come what I call the siren call of the new idea, where you'll think, oh, that idea wasn't very good. That was a bit of a false start, but I have this other idea which is fantastic, and I'm going to write that one instead. I guarantee you 20,000 words into that one, you're going to want to dump that as well. Or if it's a short story, 500 words into it. Or if it's a poem, a verse. Salman Rushdie says writers are people who finish things. I think Ray Bradbury said something similar. He said professionals are amateurs who finish things. And it doesn't matter what walk of life you're in, but if you're trying to write, if you're a poet, poets finish poems, essayists finish essays, short story writers finish short stories, novelists finish novels. You do not leave things unfinished. If you start it, you finish it. Because otherwise you set a pattern for what's to come. And you will just have a drawer filled with half-written things, half-done things. Would you go to a mechanic who said, look, I'll half-fix your car? You might get as far as Augusta, but you're going to Mangrove, but I don't wish you luck. That's not somebody you're going to go, that's not a mechanic, that's an amateur, that's a dabbler. You finish it, and you learn by finishing things. That's all I know. That's everything I know. If I was doing a workshop, I would then claim 100 quid and go, thanks very much, everybody. Good luck with your book. On the basis of that, thanks to Barbara at the store. The USM bookstore has been so kind to me over the years, right from the beginning, and I'm very grateful to her for all of her support. I'm very grateful to all of you, some familiar faces, some not, for coming along this evening. I know there are always better things to be doing in Portland. And if you need stuff signed, by all means, yes. And otherwise, thank you very much.